Good morning and welcome to an occasion where politics and pageantry are mixed, the state opening of Parliament. For John Major, the Prime Minister, this will be a politically important occasion. He hopes it'll mark the point of the restoration of his political fortunes. For John Smith, the Labour leader, it's important too. It'll be his first state opening as leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition. But for all the politicians of all parties, including the Prime Minister, they'll be on the sidelines this morning, for at centre stage and the centre of all attention will be Her Majesty the Queen, who processes from Buckingham Palace here to her Royal Palace of Westminster, here to read a speech of which she wrote not a single word. So now the scene is set. This is the House of Lords, the chamber where the speech itself will be delivered. A splendid sight, with judges in their full attire, ambassadors, peers, lords temporal, lords spiritual. And among the first of those to take her seat, Baroness Thatcher, the former Prime Minister. Next to her, Lord Callaghan, the former Prime Minister who preceded her. For Baroness Thatcher, her first state opening since her introduction to this House of Peers. Now, in November 1678, there was a nasty security scare at the Palace of Westminster. There was talk that there might have been another gunpowder plot. As it happened, it was all a rumour and it came to nothing. But ever since then, whenever there's been a state opening of Parliament, besides the more up-to-date security precautions, and of course there are those, there's also a ceremonial search. The yeomen of the guard make their way first to the Prince's chamber.
Bodyguard, halt! Bodyguard, advance, right, turn. Stand that, ease, and easy.
In full 16th century ceremonial state dress, led by the Exon.
The Queen's bodyguard and the yeomen of the guard are ready to conduct the search, sir. May I have your leave to march them off, Sir Please?
Sir, please do so.
Move to the left, as in file. Left, turn.
And led by the Exon in the magnificent plumed hat, the yeomen, the most ancient bodyguard of the sovereign, begin their search. Now, it was the predecessors of these yeomen who in 1605 most fortunately discovered the gunpowder plot. Now, led by Brian Sewell, the Deputy Director of Works, bearing the key so essential to this search, they make sure nothing of the kind shall ever happen again. The yeomen, this time, bear as weapons lamps. Later this morning, you'll see them carrying the rather lethal-looking and actually pretty lethal partisans, their normal stock in trade. They make their way through the Chamber of the Lords, through the benches, empty. All this took place at 9:30, just over an hour ago. Past the cross benches, places all laid ready. And then they go through the door, the rather splendid door, at the end of the Lord's chamber, through into the Peers' lobby. Brian Sewell first, then the Exon, turn left, following them, the yeomen. And their route next of all will take them through the chambers that run underneath, the cellars that run beneath, the chamber of the House of Lords, and right beneath the Palace of Westminster. the ceremonial search. So suitably protected, Her Majesty will deliver the speech from the sovereign's throne of state, modelled by Pugin on the medieval throne which he discovered in Westminster Abbey. Beneath the emblems of St. George and the Dragon, and all 5 orders of chivalry, there's a virtuoso piece of carving, the cloth of estate, the symbol of sovereignty, carved in wood, but made to seem like cloth, gilded. To the left of the throne, the coat of arms of the Prince of Wales, together with his motto, Ich dien. And to the right, the coat of arms of Prince Albert, who was Queen Victoria's consort, and his motto, Treu und fest. This is where he had to sit, slightly in the wings, away from his queen in those days. But now the Queen's consort has a throne right next to the sovereign's, though the consort's, you'll notice, is just 1 inch lower, and quite deliberately so. But still, the Queen's consort's throne, the one on the right, is quite a piece of furniture, recently refurbished, a splendid piece encrusted with rock crystals and enamels of royal lions. Below the galleries that run round the chamber of the House of Lords are these shields, one for every Lord Chancellor since Henry IV. The office, once called Lord Chancellor of England, and they run right up to that of the present day Chancellor, Lord Mackay of Clashfern, who today will bear the purse containing the speech to Her Majesty, which she will read. Here in the Lords, as everywhere else in the palace, Pugin has filled the scene with elaborate carved details, and reminders abound that this is a royal palace. Well, as you can see behind us, the Palace of Westminster here has been spruced up as well. It's never looked better. This is the first time that we've had a state opening with the Palace of Westminster restored in its exterior form to something like its original glory. This is the Victoria Tower, now that the decorators have left, restored to its original glory. The sheets and the scaffolding that used to wrap it up have been taken off, revealing the Anston stone and the careful work of modern stonemasons in restoring it. All this used to be discoloured and black, but now a 12-year programme of cleaning the exterior stonework is complete. Atop Victoria Tower, it glistens, and it glistens because it really is gold. There are 4,000 layers of gold leaf there. The topping out by Lord Wakeham took place at the beginning of this year. Now, there's more than one royal procession that takes place today. Before Her Majesty makes her journey from Buckingham Palace here to the Palace of Westminster, her regalia have a right regal procession all of their own. A few moments ago, in Queen Alexandra's state coach, the regalia, including the imperial state crown, which Her Majesty will wear, began their journey to Westminster. There in the state coach is the crown, which the controller of the Queen's household is looking after as the procession makes its way down the Mall. And now the procession arrives outside the splendid and spruce Palace of Westminster, past Westminster Hall, the most ancient part of the palace, and there it is, the imperial state crown and the cap of maintenance and the sword of state, each with their own guardians. Their route will take them to Victoria Tower, you see just there on the right. They come through the gates into Victoria Tower itself, with a special escort on the side, who now dismount, of watermen, because they have the special privilege of escorting the regalia along the journey. There to the right, the barge master, who is in charge of this livery company of the city. There you see the imperial state crown being carefully and delicately handled and brought out by the crown jeweler, Mr. David Thomas. Now the controller of the Queen's household, Colonel Malcolm Ross, bears it in, and he's going to go into the regalia room at the foot of the sovereign staircase. The two maces you saw following, the symbol of the crown and parliament. Here they come. And the sword of state is borne in by General Sir Edward Burgess. A dismounted troop of the household cavalry with gentlemen at arms at top. And this is the Royal Gallery next to the House of Lords. And on the right at the top, you see the Earl Marshal, the Duke of Norfolk, whose family have held that high office of state since Tudor times, making his way to the right through the Norman porch. That's the door to the right. So the crown will be brought into the Royal Gallery, past the bodyguard of the gentlemen at arms, the closest guard of the sovereign they're technically known as, not quite as ancient as the yeoman, but closer to the sovereign himself or herself. Past busts of prime ministers, through the Norman porch, and the Lord Great Chamberlain, the 5th Marquis of Cholmondeley, who looks after the sovereign and at this point looks after the crown, places it upon a table. It'll be his job to look after the sovereign when she arrives at the palace herself. And the cap of maintenance on the left, the sword of state on the right, will also now be placed here in the Royal Gallery, representing as they do the two ancient and special aspects of kingship, the things which only kings and queens and the state can do. The power over life and death, the power to make war there, and the capacity for mercy here, the cap of maintenance. And a cap like that sits inside, as you'll have seen, sits inside the crown itself. The imperial state crown was made in 1838 for the coronation of Queen Victoria. Among all the extraordinary facts about it, perhaps the most extraordinary is that upon it is one ruby, the Black Prince's, which was actually worn at Agincourt. And now, the procession of the heralds, the College of Arms. These are the gentlemen, kings, heralds, pursuivants, who used in medieval times to organize all great occasions like this, tournaments, of which there are many. And they wear tabards, as they're called, these magnificent costumes, and the coats of arms upon their back denoted in medieval times which family they came from, and more to the point, whether they were friend or foe. They're going off towards the door where the sovereign herself will appear to greet her and to help form bodyguard for her. The scene now in the Royal Gallery, you see a portrait of the Queen to the right of the shot. And now the first of the royal family are arriving. The Duke and Duchess of Kent arrive. They'll come in up the sovereign staircase. The Duchess of Kent wearing the white ball gown, always worn by the royal family on state occasions like these. And wearing the Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order. That's the splendid sash that she wears, followed by the Duke. And she's talking now to the Lord Great Chamberlain, makes her way on. I'd be wishing him better. He had a nasty spot of flu, but he's now recovered. Now this is the other place, as they call it round here, the members' lobby of the House of Commons. Either side of the doors that lead towards the chamber, Winston Churchill on the left and Lloyd George on the right survey proceedings as MPs wander around. Goodness gracious me, that's Sir Nicholas Fairbairn in his own very special costume to lend colour to these occasions. The rest of them in mufti by comparison, all waiting to hear what John Major will have in mind for them as the government's programme for the next session of Parliament. Now Her Majesty herself begins her procession from her Buckingham Palace. The 1st and 2nd Division of the Sovereign's escort proceed. Her Majesty rides in the Irish State Coach. Her Majesty the Queen wearing the diamond diadem, which she'll wear until she later exchanges it for the imperial state crown to read the speech itself. This procession turns into the Mall on a crisp and clear November morning. And this is the route that a little later on Her Majesty and this splendid procession will take. At the end of the Mall, under the eye of Nelson, at the top of Nelson's Arch in Trafalgar Square, she'll come through Admiralty Arch and turn to the right here into Whitehall, where the ministries, her ministers, perform their duties in the buildings either side. She'll pass the cenotaph where just a few days ago wreaths were laid to commemorate the Great War, and then past the building with the pepper pot on the right, the newly refurbished, one of the newly refurbished buildings of the Palace of Westminster itself, through Parliament Square to Parliament. Past Westminster Hall, and these, the boys and just a few girls of Westminster School, have a special job, not just to watch in their privileged position, which they do, of course, but the privilege is because their school was originally founded by Queen Elizabeth I, and they come here to cheer, and have to cheer. And they've just been seeing the second royal arrival of the morning, that of the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester. And she, you see, wears the same sash, which you saw just earlier, of the same Royal Victorian order. Now, the Queen's journey will take her up the same staircase and finally into this, the Royal Robing Room. And this is a sovereign's eye view of the Royal Robing Room, which features a cloth of estate, but this time it's literally made of cloth and not of wood. And there's a throne chair, not to be confused with the throne itself. There are thrones all over the place here, but the real one, the throne, is the one in the Lords. This one is embroidered with the initials VR, Victoria Regina. This Palace of Westminster was opened by her in 1852, fully completed in 1888. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth will leave through this door from the Royal Robing Room into the Royal Gallery. So there you see the route through which she'll come. And now, moving to greet her, is the procession of the Lord Chancellor, the office that dates back to the Lord Chancellor of England. You see him there at the center of it wearing the wig. In his magnificent formal dress, the Lord Chancellor, Lord Mackay of Clashfern, with his train bearer behind, Mrs. Nora Dobinson. The deputy train bearer, Mr. Harry Haffington. Now, this was perhaps the big political job of one time, the Executive Office of State. The job's changed a lot. It was the job that Sir Thomas More held, among other great and famous figures, but now it still has great importance. He's the person who advises Her Majesty on the appointment of the judiciary, and he has a civil service of 10,800 of his own. Now you see the object that he is now carrying. He now has with him the purse, which does contain, the Queen's speech, which she will read. And he goes to greet his sovereign at the base of these stairs. A few more members of Parliament now scurrying hither and thither. Real politics commences this afternoon with the debate on the Queen's speech, which runs on several days. Begins with a suitably proper address of thanks from a couple of MPs, and then it gets into the political stuff. There's been restoration work outside and inside this Palace of Westminster. These magnificent gilded doors are the ones that guard the chamber of the House of Lords. And at the back there you see the two thrones and the cloth of estate, an extraordinary scene showing you where Her Majesty will make the speech. She'll be able to look right through to the Commons when she makes her speech. And now her procession is in Trafalgar Square. What a splendid sight it is. Alderney, Twilight, Auckland and St Patrick pull the Irish stagecoach. And the members of her household ride in the state landau. Watched by enthusiastic crowds. And now the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester and the Duke and Duchess of Kent make their way into the Royal Gallery towards the places that they'll occupy. Just through the Royal Gallery, to our right here, is the Chamber of the Lords, so you have the geography right, and they'll have seats, the best seats in the place, just below the thrones themselves, just to the right. On our picture, they'll be sitting just to the right of the sovereigns. Now there's a rare sight. The chamber of the House of Lords, Her Majesty's House of Peers. On the left of the shot that you can see now, on the left are ambassadors, and they rise to greet the royal party. The judges in the center, bewigged. The two duchesses are escorted to their seat next to the splendidly attired wives of the ambassadors to the court of St. James. Right next to the royal party are the wives of the ambassadors from the East Caribbean states. So the wives of the ambassadors from Antigua, Barbados, Lesotho, Uganda, the wife of the Cypriot ambassador, the Australian ambassador, and then peeresses and countesses in their seats. Besides those all coming to see the splendor of this occasion are those who use this place as their place of work. Lord Hailsham, on the left of your picture, the former Lord Chancellor. who spoke once of an elective dictatorship before he had his present job. Next to him, Lord Cledwin, Lord Tordoff, the Liberal Democrat, Lord Graham of Edmonton, Lord Ampthill, there's Baroness Hilton Foster, Lord Jenkins of Hill Head, and Lord Richard, who's leader of the Labour Party in the House of Lords, once our ambassador at the United Nations. And this splendid sight, a convocation of judges in red robes, the Lord Chief Justice, the Master of the Rolls, and the President of the Family Division and the Lord Chancellor of the Chancery Division. In black and gold robes are the Lords of Appeal, Lord Justice Dillon, Lord Justice Kennedy, Lord Justice Hurst. To the left, our left, of the throne are the ambassadors. Now, their seats are governed not by their importance or the size of their country, not in that sense, but by their precedence, their seniority at the court of St. James, the number of years that they've served there. So you see that El Salvador has top position, pole position, and next, the representative from the Holy See of the Vatican. At the center of the picture, on the left, the sovereign's throne, from which she'll deliver the speech. And now Her Majesty arrives at her Palace of Westminster. Acknowledges the crowds. State coach arrives in Victoria Tower, and the royal standard is broken out. Her Majesty is greeted by the Lord Great Chamberlain, the Marquis of Cholmondeley, an office which his family hold by rotation. There are three families who share this ancient high office of state. The heralds precede her. The two maces which represent Crown and Parliament, so that after these formal ceremonial proceedings are over, Parliament may begin its debates with the maces, with their crown, which represent the sovereign and her authority. And Her Majesty will make her way now to the royal robing room, which the Lord Great Chamberlain looks after for her in her royal palace. There to be exchange the silver diadem for her imperial state crown, and the doors close of the royal robing room. Next of all, in a few minutes' time, we shall see her emerge and process for the speech itself. So these are the politicians. Now, if you look at them, you'd think they look, there's Janice Skinner, pretty ordinary by comparison with all the splendid stuff we've been seeing before, and indeed, that's the role that they play this morning. They have standing room only at the back of the House of Lords, but that shouldn't necessarily be confused with the power that they, and especially that ministers, now wield. There's a sense of constitutional reform in the air, and that's the question that we want now to address. With us now in our studio just before the Palace of Westminster are Robert Blake, Lord Blake, the historian, and Lord Brown Wilkinson, who's a Lord of Appeal in Ordinary, a law lord. Thank you both very much indeed for coming to join us. We know, Lord Blake, that ministers are much more important than they were. Do you think they're becoming too important?
Yes, I do. I think that the exercise of the royal prerogative has become rather excessive now.
These are the powers that they exercise in her name.
Exactly. It's nothing to do with the Queen personally at all. It's the powers that they exercise in her name. The amount of power she exercises herself are very limited now indeed. But there's no doubt, I think, that what with the practice of delegated legislation and so on, that government has a very great deal of unchecked power now, and I feel that this is undesirable, and many people do.
Well, if that was so, Lord Brown Wilkinson, it would be very serious. We saw Lord Hailsham earlier on in our pictures at his seat in the Lords. He once spoken of elective dictatorship. Do you think that danger exists, is growing? Why should it matter?
Yes, I think it's a graphic phrase to describe a phenomenon which is there. The government, using its whips, controls the majority in Parliament, can put through what it likes. The democratic process of an opposition effectively opposing a government has been much diminished. And therefore these regulations can be made, the act can be passed, and that's where the courts come in.
Can you give me an example, before we get on to what you might next do about it, of the sort of delegated legislation which Lord Blake has talked about? It might be completely mysterious to anybody listening. What do you mean? How does it affect you and me?
Well, an example which has no immediate legal reality, but is probably understandable. The Child Support Act provides what an absent father is to provide for his children. There is a very complicated mathematical formula laid down in the Act itself, but the Minister is given power to make regulations as to the minimum amount with which the absent father is to be left. Now that is, of course, an extraordinarily wide power in its scope, because he, according to the literal meaning of the words, could say he needn't be left with anything.
A minister could literally do that?
Well, on the bare meaning of the words, yes, because it is up to him to prescribe what is the minimum amount the father is to be left with. He'd never do it. I'm not suggesting that this is an immediate reality, being left with nothing, but there's room for discussion as to what should that be, the minimum amount a father is left with.
Now, as a result of these excesses, if they are, of delegated legislation, we've seen the growth of a countervailing power, Lord Blake, which is judges, like Lord Brown Wilkinson, using the process of judicial review as something like a constitutional check. Now that's an odd development in our constitution, isn't it?
It is a curious one, and it's a recent one, and whether it's desirable or not, I can see why it's happened. I think it is because there is a sense in which Parliament is not doing its duty properly, and that things have to be remedied and put straight to some degree by the judges, by this procedure of judicial review, which Lord Brown Wilkinson can talk about with much more authority than I can, actually.
So you judges, are turning into a check and balance in a sort of outgrowth of the Constitution, which you consider, I suppose, practically necessary, but was hardly the way things were, in quotes, meant to happen.
I don't think that's quite true. I'm not sure I agree with Lord Blake about this. The judges have always been there to control the use by the executive of its powers. Nobody, not even the government, can do something unless it has power under the law to do it. It's always been the court's job to control, make sure that the executive use its powers rightly. What has happened is that the government is now mixed up in all our lives, in every aspect of it. So there are many more occasions on which it might be said that they are exceeding their powers.
But if you have ministers who have very wide-ranging powers, inevitably it's going to come to the case that these problems are going to get worse and worse, and judicial review will matter in a different way.
Oh, undoubtedly. I think it is, I'm not underestimating its importance. If there is no satisfactory parliamentary check, then the courts have to pick it up.
My lords, what's happening now, as you can see, is the beginning of the Speaker's procession. This happens every day in what their lordships call the other place. Before they do any business, Madam Speaker, preceded by her own officials, there's Madam Speaker there, Betty Boothroyd, in her splendid parliamentary robes, the first commoner in the land. She has her own, if we dare say so, rather regal procession through the Commons, and followed by her chaplain, because the very first thing that happens every day in the Commons, this one being no exception, is that they have prayers from which we and our cameras are excluded. Splendid stentorian shout by the policeman. And Madam Speaker goes through central lobby towards members' lobby for the start of business there. So, Madam Speaker has done her stuff and opened up business in the Commons, or will be opening it up, but there is a problem, as we've been discussing here with the Law Lord and with the historian Lord Blake, which is that the ministers who parade in front of Madam Speaker and appear to be under her control, appear to be under very little control indeed. The question that arises, Lord Blake, is if things were as bad as you've both been saying, what should be done about it?
Well, I am personally in favour of a Bill of Rights. I rather agree with Lord Hailsham on that. But if one didn't go as far as that, at least I think we ought to accept the European Convention of Human Rights. I was on the Select Committee of the House of Lords a few years ago, which recommended that we should do that, though nothing was actually done about it, I need hardly say. But I think at least that we should do.
When you say you need hardly say, you mean because it was never suitable for any government to try and check its own powers?
Exactly. That is the great difficulty about reforming this aspect of our Constitution. It is not really in anybody's interest in government circles, or possibly even in opposition circles, to do anything about it.
Lord Brown-Wilkinson, what would you do? Would you bring in a Bill of Rights? And to go on to Lord Blake's own point, assuming these things to be frightfully inconvenient to governments who like to be in charge, how would you make sure it happened?
Well, I don't think there's any way in which you can force it to come in. It is a political decision. It will happen or it won't happen. I rather share Lord Blake's view it's unlikely to happen with the people in power. It's the court's job to protect the interests of the individual. I believe that there is within our own law a seed which can defend individual human rights in the way the European Convention does. If they do not introduce the European Convention, then I think it is for the courts to defend individual freedom against a mass majority whipped government.
But those are rather hard words. If things go on as you expect, both expect them to go on, will we be worse governed than we ought to be, and why will it matter? Lord Blake.
I think it will matter because the present system is inefficient. I think you are
talking of worse than inefficiency. You were talking of a deficit of our freedoms.
Well, to some extent that's true, yes. I think that the disadvantage under which we're labouring at the moment is that ministers can do things without really proper attention being paid to what they're doing by Parliament, and they can, in a way, act direct, using the royal prerogative, to an extent which is possibly dangerous to our liberties.
Lord Blake, Lord Brown-Wilkinson, thank you both very much indeed. This is the scene then at the door of the royal robing room. Moments before, Her Majesty the Queen is due to process through the royal gallery to the chamber of the House of Lords. Her Majesty and the Duke of Edinburgh, preceded by the Sword of State and the Lord Great Chamberlain and the Earl Marshal, both walking backwards out of deference to their sovereign. So the cap of maintenance and the Sword of State, which we mentioned earlier, both now being brought in the row behind the Lord Great Chamberlain and the Earl Marshal. The symbols of the sovereign's office and power precede her, and following her, her pages. One of these, by the way, makes up a son and father act. One of the pages, Edward Lowther, is walking four ahead in the procession of the captain of the Honourable Corps of Gentlemen at Arms, the Viscount Ullswater, who is his pop. And the House of Lords await Her Majesty. The Earl Marshal enters and signals to everyone to be standing. And the sovereign ascends to the throne of state.
My lords, pray be seated.
Next, she will indicate to the Lord Great Chamberlain that she's ready. He's there to the right, there he is. And he will indicate by a wave of his stick to Black Rod, and that is done. And the yeoman usher of the Black Rod, preceded by Inspector Barry Robertson, and the principal doorkeeper of the House of Lords, and there's the yeoman usher, Air Commodore Alan Curry. He makes his way now upon the Sovereign's commission. His job now to command the House of Commons to come and listen to the Queen's speech. But both they, the Commons, and the Sovereign will do this now to suit themselves. Because after this long and awesome procession down towards the House of Commons, the doors at the end of the journey now open, and you can see right through to the Commons chamber now. The doors will be closed in his face, and you'll have to knock 3 times to demand entrance, to show that they, the Commons, are nobody's poodles and won't simply come running when asked. That ceremony is the present derivation of a long battle of authority. Black Rod enters the chamber of the Commons. Goes to the bar of the Commons.
Madam Speaker, the Queen commands this honourable House to attend upon Her Majesty immediately in the House of Peers.
So that ritual suited both sides. You saw him bow twice, once to left, once to right, in the middle of his speech, and they bowed back. And now Madam Speaker leads the Commons on a journey back towards the Lords, where they'll have standing room at the back. And this is a scene that you don't see every day. The best of enemies, John Smith, John Major walking together, John Cunningham and the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Hurd, Sir Edward Heath, and now behind them a splendid David Blunkett, escorted by Virginia Bottomley. And all of these, the Secretary of State for Health and her opposition shadow, Robin Cook, Michael Heseltine, Mr. McGregor, all of these, to all intents and purposes, great mates. But this afternoon, they'll begin to slug it out in the debate on the Queen's speech. But what they're emphasizing here is that they are members of the Commons. They're all streaming out now, you see, from the Commons chamber, and that they'll behave to a certain extent as they choose. Now, Black Rod, the yeoman usher of the Black Rod, escorts Madam Speaker at the head of the procession, bringing the Commons to the Lords. Mr. Blunkett with his guide dog, Sir Atkins, Bernie Grant, splendid costume, Tony Banks, a little less splendid, but splendid nonetheless. Andrew Foulds, James Molyneux, leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, a significant part they may be playing in this next session of Parliament. Chairman of the 1922 Committee of Backbenchers there, Sir Marcus Fox. And they enter the Lords. Bow to Her Majesty. And they come as far as the bar and no further. They congregate, nestling up against the bar of the House. That's the barrier just in front of your picture here. Still pouring in. And next of all, it'll be the job of the Lord Chancellor, there you see him now, bearing the purse which contains the speech, to give it to his sovereign. Hands her the speech, then has the tricky task of retreating backwards down the steps.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, the Duke of Edinburgh and I look forward to our tour of Caribbean countries next spring. We shall visit France to inaugurate with the President of the French Republic the Channel Tunnel in May, and to attend the ceremonies to mark the 50th anniversary of the Normandy landings in June. We shall visit Canada to attend the Commonwealth Games in August. My government attach the highest importance to national security. They will maintain full support for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They will work to secure NATO's adaptation to the changing security environment and to continue developing the operational role of the Western European Union. My government will work for a full implementation of the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty and for the entry into force of the Open Skies Treaty. Britain's minimum independent nuclear deterrent will be maintained. My government will work for the effective implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention to prevent proliferation of weapons of mass destruction to promote the indefinite and unconditional extension of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and to encourage international responsibility in conventional arms transfers. They will take part constructively in negotiations on a verifiable and comprehensive nuclear test ban. They will continue to help with the safe and secure transport of nuclear weapons for dismantling in the former Soviet Union. Now that the Treaty of Maastricht has entered into force, my government will attach particular importance to implementing the new common foreign and security policy and intergovernmental cooperation in the fields of justice and home affairs. They will work to ensure that the principle of subsidiarity is applied to European community legislation. My government will promote financial and budgetary discipline in the community. They will work within the community for a successful conclusion to the Uruguay round of trade negotiations. My government will work for a rapid conclusion of accession agreements with Austria, Finland, Norway and Sweden, and will continue to put forward the case for European countries which are ready and wish to join the European community. My government will strive for a peaceful settlement in the former Yugoslavia. They will provide help for political and economic reform in the states of the former Soviet Union and their integration into the international community. My government will play a constructive role in strengthening the United Nations' capacity to undertake peacekeeping and preventive action. They will work for full Iraqi compliance with Security Council resolutions. My government welcomed the recent breakthrough in the Middle East peace process. They will continue to support efforts to bring lasting peace to the region. My government will work for the long-term stability and prosperity of Hong Kong and to cooperate with China to implement the Sino-British Joint Declaration in the best interests of the Hong Kong people. My government will play an active part in the Commonwealth. They will support construction of a democratic society in South Africa. My government will maintain a substantial aid program to promote sustainable development and good government. My government will introduce legislation to place the Secret Intelligence Service and Government Communications Headquarters on a statutory basis, and to make further provisions for the oversight and accountability of them and the Security Service. In Northern Ireland, my government will continue their efforts to defeat terrorism through impartial and resolute enforcement of the law, to uphold the democratic wishes of its people and seek political progress by broadly based agreement, to strengthen economic progress, and to create equality of opportunity for all sections of the community. They will maintain positive relations with the Republic of Ireland. My government will maintain their fight against terrorism throughout the United Kingdom and elsewhere. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public service will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government will continue with firm financial policies designed to support continuing economic growth and rising employment based on permanently low inflation. My government will bring together tax and expenditure decisions in a unified budget. Fiscal policy will be set to bring the budget deficit back towards balance over the medium term. my government will reduce the share of national income taken by the public sector. They will continue to promote enterprise and improve the supply performance of the economy. The Citizens' Charter will remain central to my government's programme for improving public services. Legislation will be introduced to give force to the changes in the European Community system of own resources, following the agreement at the Edinburgh European Council. Legislation will be introduced to facilitate deregulation and to remove obstacles to contracting out by central and local government. My government will continue to give priority to law and order. Legislation will be introduced to allow the courts to deal more effectively with young offenders and to make improvements in the criminal law. A bill will be introduced to improve the organisation and management of the police so that they are better able to combat crime and to strengthen the administration of magistrates' courts. My government will continue to develop its policies on social security so that help is concentrated on those most in need and expenditure is kept within affordable limits. Legislation will be introduced to raise the national insurance contributions paid by employees. Legislation will be introduced to privatise British coal. My government will bring forward legislation to reform local government in Scotland and Wales. My government will introduce legislation to establish new arrangements for funding teacher training in England and Wales and to reform student unions. My government will bring forward a bill to reform the law on Sunday trading in England and Wales. Bills will be introduced to take forward Environment Agency planning and to reform the law on trademarks. Other measures will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
So the Lord Chancellor, who delivered the speech, now retrieves it and makes the same journey back down the stairs. Her Majesty and the Duke of Edinburgh rise. And the Queen's speech, having been delivered in the Chamber of the Lords, they bow to those who come to listen to their sovereign and make their way out of the chamber and here, behind the Lords temporal and spiritual, the members of the House of Commons now begin to drift back towards their chamber. Looking forward to the start of business this afternoon. And through the Royal Gallery, Her Majesty and the Duke of Edinburgh preceded, just as they were before, by the Lord Great Chamberlain and the Earl Marshal, and with the sword of state and the cap of maintenance at the head of this procession, Her Majesty wearing the imperial state crown. Goes through the Royal Gallery as she begins her journey of departure from the Palace of Westminster. As you can see now in the Lords, most of the members of the Commons have departed back for their place, the other place, as each chamber of the House rather archly calls the other, and they're now going through the central lobby back to their place. And now the mace, which you saw being brought in earlier, with the other mace for the House of Lords, is placed upon the table of the Commons. Now that is there, this session of Parliament may begin. The Constitution says that we are governed by the Crown in Parliament. The Crown at the head of that mace represents the Crown in Parliament, and there can be no sitting of the Commons and the Lords without that the mace is there. Now, this afternoon, in the House of Commons, the scene will be back to its normal rumbustious condition. Not much ceremony, though there will be some at the beginning, as they have the Queen's speech debate, taking apart the speech which Her Majesty has read, the speech written, of course, by the Prime Minister, John Major. Now, to discuss that speech, we have three politicians limbering up, ready for action. First of all, the Minister in Mr. Heseltine's department, Neil Hamilton, who's responsible for deregulation, which, as you saw, will feature largely in the next session of Parliament. Mr. John Prescott, who's recently been promoted to be the Shadow Secretary of State from Employment from his previous position at Transport, and Mr. Charles Kennedy, who's the President of the Liberal Democrats, member of their party in the House of Commons. Well, first of all, Mr. Prescott, deregulation is the new word. That's going to be rather difficult to oppose, isn't it? It's rather hard to say that you're in favour of more regulation and against less.
No, I think any good industry or good community has to have fair regulation. And indeed, we're waiting to see exactly what the government is going to do with that. But I must say it's not new. In 1985, they produced all these statements, having consulted all 200 businesses. I'm bound to say health and safety, the one I'm particularly concerned with, deregulation, was very low level with the employers and seeing how important it was. But on the matter of the deregulation, people have said, should you have your pegs on coats so many inches apart? That might be something that needs changing, I don't know. But the fundamental concern is it going to be night dresses for children, for example, to protect them from fire? We must wait to see. Is it going to be the fire regulations in old people's homes to be reduced? That's what some people have been calling for. Is it the taking away in health and safety the right to have regulations that if they are replaced must be done so by a better provision? If they're going to take away that statutory requirement, then we are embarked upon a reduction of safety in industry, which I believe will lead us to the situation we had before 1974 of the kind of killing fields in accidents and deaths in industry.
Well, Mr. Prescott's put a question to you. What's your answer?
Well, John Prescott, of course, is an Olympic gold medalist at scaremongering, and he and his colleagues have been shroud-waving in the newspapers and on television without ceasing in recent weeks. And the government has made it absolutely clear in the case of nursing homes, the nightwear regulations, the fire regulations in respect of furniture, that we're not going to reduce necessary protection. That they're not going to reduce necessary protection. We haven't come to any final decisions on this yet. All that has happened so far is that we've asked business, what would you like to see changed? Now, those proposals will be considered inside our departments. Others will be consulted, consumer interests, local authorities, all those. Even the Labour Party, if it is seriously interested in deregulation, can put its own proposals forward.
The Liberal Democrats, can I ask you, Charles Kennedy, do you think that deregulation will be difficult to oppose? Because, as I was saying earlier to Mr. Prescott, on the face of it, it's very hard to stand up and say we're in favour of more regulations.
Well, I don't think it's going to be one of these bills that is going to be either blanket condemnation or blanket support.
How do you think it'll play politically?
Well, let's take this analogy that Neil's drawn of Olympic gold medals. I think this is the marathon bill of this particular Parliament, because there's going to be a myriad. Well, I fear that we may be on only the second lap as far as that's concerned. I think that what it will do is arouse either support or antagonism amongst a whole range of pressure groups, lobby groups, professional groups, voluntary sector, and so on and so forth, across a whole range of issues. And I think that the government will find that a great deal of this Parliament is taken up. I think you'll find Labour and ourselves will probably support some aspects with a sensible deregulation, as John's indicated. But on other matters, take something less emotive than fire-resistant clothes for children. Take building regulations. Now, that is a potential, if you'll pardon the pun, minefield of employers, employees, building contractors, subcontractors, and so on.
But do you think, Charles Kennedy, that it'll increase the sense, which is one reading of it, of Mr. Major as being a practical chap and getting politics back onto a practical, sensible agenda, or will it, as Mr. Prescott suggested, be an echo of Victorian values in the worst sense of the term?
I suspect it will be neither when all's said and done. I think it will be part of a general theme that runs through this Queen's speech, which is that after the horrors of the last parliamentary year, the last session, the government does not want too many tight votes with a dozen Tory backbenchers being able to hold their fortune in their hands. So that's why a lot of this is actually not too contentious in terms of the government losing a majority.
Nice, quiet Queen's speech. There was a bit of deregulation that didn't happen. London buses were going to be deregulated. Is that because you've had enough of a fright already over the Railways Bill, where I believe there's a director of railway regulation, there's a director of franchising, there's Railtrack? Doesn't seem like much deregulation in that.
Well, obviously, where you've got a monopoly system in place, it's impossible to bring about competition overnight. And during the period until competition is able to develop, we found in the case of other utilities that regulation is necessary.
But, so you have more regulation on the way to a perfect free market?
Well, obviously, if you
So you're a minister for more regulation in some situations and less in others?
It's just that when you move from monopoly to competition, the monopolist provider is obviously in a dominant position to start with. So we've always, of course, said that there is room for sensible regulation, and exponents of consensus like John Prescott and myself will be able to agree.
Oh, that's sort of, he's a minister. That's he's a minister. It's quite. There's no problem. He's a minister.
Bureaucracy. There's no doubt.
He's a minister for
it.
sensible regulation.
But
that's
every
right.
kind of reorganisation they've done, whether it's in the health service, has always led to more bureaucracy. And it started out saying less. Mr. Redwood's led the cat out the bag by saying he's appointed, what, 12,000 bureaucrats and 20 doctors. Now, that's somebody in the cabinet who's looked at it. But let me say to Mr. Hamilton, he did us all that kind of drama at the conference of tearing up 3,500 regulations. 71% of them came under this government since 1979.
Mr. Hamilton, there wasn't any mention by Her Majesty in the Queen's speech written by her Prime Minister of going back to basics in so many words. Is that because you rather wish that you'd never started with that?
No, certainly not. Back to basics is, of course, the theme of the legislation.
We got it wrong and we're going to start again.
Well, unlike John Prescott, we are prepared. We are prepared.
Mr. Prescott, let him speak. We're not in the Chamber of the Commons now, Mr. Hamilton.
Well, he's used to behaving in a deregulated way, such as he is at the moment, just as he usually speaks in a deregulated way. But the government is going back to basics. The government is going back to basics in the sense that we are taking through all the legislation of the coming year on a theme of common sense and what will appeal to ordinary people. And we don't want overburdened regulations on industry, because that cuts the opportunities for jobs, it reduces profits, therefore it reduces investment. So I hope the Labour Party will take a sensible and constructive approach to deregulation. We're not going to compromise on essential safety, we're cutting red tape.
Let me put a question to you, Mr. Prescott.
So we're going back to crime then, to the 100% less levels that we had before under Labour. Is that what we're saying? Back to basics?
Well, 100% less means nothing at all, of course.
Well, if you want to be
I think you should take some lessons in arithmetic.
Will you accept then, can I just ask you a basic question? Will you accept on crime figures that they've increased 140% since 1979 according to the Home Office figures? Do you accept that simple question even for you to understand?
No. Labour has voted against every single measure that we've introduced in the last 14 years to increase sentences, to improve conditions of service for the police, to reconsider lenient sentences. They vote against the Prevention of Terrorism Act every year. If you think that the Labour Party is going to be tough on crime, I think you need your head examined.
Basic means you're going to reduce it. Does it mean that?
That's the aim.
Oh, is it?
To reduce crime levels.
So it increased
Of
through that
course.
period.
But we won't.
Total mess of policy.
Mr. Prescott, can I ask if the Labour Party is going to be developing its policies so that they in the end up with a policy very similar to the one the Conservatives just had? There hasn't been a Queen's speech, of course, in the Labour Party, but isn't the Commission for Social Justice a threat from your point of view that Labour is going to move towards an agenda of targeted social policies, that's in this Queen's speech from the Conservative government, inimical to you, and that's going to be the next battle inside your party, the degree to which you move to catch them up?
John Smith saw really the real problem of how you deal with welfare expenditure and employment in a civilized society. Wealth and welfare go together. That's what Beveridge and Keynes was about. But at the heart of that problem is you've got to have full employment. And the unemployed figures today show that it would take them 10 years even to get back to the levels of basics, which were 1979, when it was less than 1 million.
Mr. Prescott, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Hamilton, thank you very much for joining us all. Well, the Queen's speech has been well and truly delivered, and Her Majesty the Queen now is set to return from this Palace of Westminster back to her Buckingham Palace, her London home. And now she's leaving the Palace of Westminster just behind us now, as her procession sets off across London. This afternoon, the politicians will begin to debate their Queen's speech. Coverage of that on BBC Two begins just after the news at 3 o'clock. But now from all of us here at the state opening of Parliament, goodbye.